if you hear me. Black is beautiful. Santa Claus. Black is beautiful. It's a texture of color. Lift your head like me. You got to wear your collar with dignity. How it burns out. Black is beautiful. I said, sing it along. Black is beautiful. Say, I'm black and brown. It's high time that we get rid of that old slave mentality.
Perpetrators who created this whole new world, those whose aim was to fill their coffers with diamonds, rubies, and gold. Hey, I don't want to raise no hornet's nest. It's justice I put into the test. Satmaraj and Kaprap and Bun, all you're talking compensation, but not from them struggling governments are wrong. That's wrong. Tell you have to pay we back for the centuries of labor. Pay we back for the licks and the torture aid. If the Holocaust victims get, how come them ain't pay we yet? Come on and pay we back for slavery and indenture. Pay we back for the ills that we suffer. It's high time to pay some reparation to the Caribbean. It's high time that they pay some compensation. Thank you. Oh, yeah, yeah. Since they're gone, we carry one image, struggling class and disadvantaged, backyards, ghettos and slums, the hallmark of the Caribbean, financial and social depression, and no push, don't talk about brain drain, always in a World Bank confusion, hustling for foreign exchange, and yet, I don't want to raise no hornet's nest, but this is something we must address. Selwyn Kojo Ramesh Maharaj, I want to put all you two in charge, cause it ain't too late to lobby for human rights. Pick up the fight, pay we back, we never begged them to come here. Pay we back for the rape and the murder, and like they forget what Shoki said. Here we grandfather back pay. Come on and pay we back. The Caribbean call it pay we back, because a payment outstanding. It's high time to pay some reparation to this suffering Caribbean. More than time that they pay some compensation. Don't you agree? Yeah, man. It's been done all over the world. Including the Caribbean. Tell me, how could the Caribbean survive the competition, the harsh economic race? They keep slamming doors in we face. We bananas, beaches and culture, we forever hustling to sell. Put this on CARICOM agenda and let them know we ain't doing too well. I don't want to raise for hornet's, but the Japanese victims get redressed. So about Africans and Asians, victims of colonization, left to languish in this shifting tropical space. Where, come on and pay we back, the minority thriving, pay we back, but the masses suffering, yes. Checking airports and embassies to escape from their misery. Lewis and Eric William Butler and them labor unions, they try to secure for we some measure of decency. But when you check a Guyanese dollar or talk to a Haitian brother, then I'm sure you'll agree with me that they leave we in misery. I don't want to raise no hornet's nest. Some might say just forgive and forget. But when you check on an English pound to a Trini is 10 to 1, while riches still gleaming in the British crown. Then come on and pay we back the Caribbean uneasy. Pay we back with the struggling currency oil. Let's remove the poverty line. We want it in cash, not in fine. Come on and pay we back. I hear the prince was visiting. Pay we back. I hope he carried this home with him. It's high time he pays some compensation to the Caribbean. More than time that they pay some reparation. Thank you. Oh, yeah, yeah.
Well, good evening and welcome to this evening's edition of Politics 101. Lady B from Trinidad and Tobago, one of the lesser known Calypsonians. She died early, she died in her 40s of cancer, but she was one of the up and coming Calypsonians, and she lived longer. She would have been up there with Calypso Rose and Singing Sandra, and of course, all the men. She was part of the United Sisters. Remember, Wo Donkey, the United Sisters, and she did that song on reparations, and we've been talking about reparations. Last night we played Tiny and the Mighty Sparrow, and Lady B in that calypso comes at the issue from a Caribbean standpoint, the Caribbean integration perspective, pay some compensation for the Caribbean. She didn't stress the African compensation only. She talked about compensation for indentureship, for slavery, for the Caribbean, and she focused her attention on the Europeans, making the case of reparations. She one of the important voices. Good evening to all of you. Good evening to all of you. Good evening to you in Guyana. Welcome to Politics 101. Good evening to those of you who are in the diaspora as I am. This evening I'm coming to you from Arizona. And I know last night I was in Guyana and traveled and in Arizona, coming to you from the desert. It's quite early here. It's just after 4 here, 3 hours behind the East Coast. Good evening to all of you on the East Coast of the United States of America, Canada. Welcome. Good night to you in London, in other parts of Europe. It's wonderful to be alive at a time of great transformation. Some say transformation for the worse. Some hope that it will be transformation for the better. Welcome to all of you. Welcome to all Guyanese, because we share that civic space. We share that space called Guyana, all of us from our different cultural background, our different ethnic background. Reparations comes from the term repair a damage that was done. Clearly, slavery did serious damage to the victims of slavery. It also messed up white people too. You can't enslave dehumanize people for 400 years and your mind don't get messed up. So, white people also have to emancipate themselves from mental slavery, you know. But we're Africans and we're talking about our condition. And so Africans have to continue that process of emancipation. Good evening, Ozia, um, uh, down there in the south of the United States, South Carolina, and those of you in Georgia, especially in the Atlanta area, that period, that part of the world is pregnant with history. And there's a relationship, of course, between the south of the United States, well, United States in general, and our Caribbean. The end of the triumph of the Haitian Revolution led to the exodus of a lot of the slave masters, and they went to the south of the United States, ended up in places like Louisiana and so forth. And of course, we know that led to the Louisiana Purchase, France having been beaten so badly, Napoleon beaten so badly by the Haitians, they sold out. They sold large chunk of land in the south of the United States to the Americans for next to nothing. The Louisiana Purchase. And lots of the Asian slave masters fled to the United States, the southern United States. And they were, I was about to say stupid enough, but I don't think they were stupid. They just weren't thinking, and they took slaves with them, some of their slaves, and of course they spread the word among the enslaved population in the United States of what's happening in Haiti. And that led to a stark increase in slave rebellions in the south of the United States. So the Haitian Revolution, had consequences, not just for Haiti, but for the south of the United States of America, and of course for all of us in the African diaspora. Hello, if there are any Haitians, listen, Haiti is continues to go through its turmoils, and those turmoils are directly related to the triumph of the Haitian Revolution in 1804. In fact, Haiti and Haitians are today paying for that revolution. We know that the French, supported by the United States, in 1825, threatened to reinvade Haiti. And they were able to extort from the Haitians between 30 to 50 billion US dollars in today's money. It took the Haitians almost 100 years to pay that ransom, because that's what it was to the French. It means that everything the Haitians were producing was to pay the French for their own freedom. But the French said Haitian freedom meant that France lost income, my God. And then when they were just about to finish paying, the Americans marched in to Haiti, 1915, claiming that the Haitians owed American banks money, and they raided the Haitian treasury. In fact, they stayed in Haiti up until 1934, the Americans. And so you're talking about a country that has continuously paid the price for our freedom. Cruel, 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 very cruel. And so the underdevelopment that we see in Haiti today, the confusion that we see in Haiti is directly related to the sabotage of the Haitian society. On the one hand, Haiti was isolated. You see, after the revolution triumphed in 1804, the Americans did not recognize Haiti until 1865. Haiti, in a sense, was isolated. Now, what that isolation did is that it reproduced Africa in its purest sense. That is why when you go to Haiti today, it is perhaps the purest African culture in the world, even more than Africa itself. Because at the time when Africa was being immersed into the wider Eurocentric culture, Haiti was isolated and they were able to reproduce Africa, as I said. So, on the one hand, the isolation led to the reproduction of Africa. You go to Haiti today, you can't help but recognizing that you're in Africa. But on the other hand, it led to the degradation, further degradation of that country. And today, the turmoil that we've seen there is a direct result. And it has continued over time, you know. The sponsoring of Haitian strongmen by the West during the Cold War, the kidnapping of Aristide when he came to power as a legitimate leader, hosting of Aristide, the kidnapping of Aristide. Today, Haiti has no army. And if you don't have a country without protective forces, you can imagine the fact that the warlords are there. And there's divided opinion on the initiative, the Kenyans going into Haiti. Yes, they are our African brothers and sisters, but we have had that experience of these peacekeeping forces in Haiti. They have made the situation worse. The last time there were peacekeeping forces there. So understandably, there is divided opinion on Kenya sending troops into Haiti. Now, I would have preferred, and many people would have preferred CARICOM to have played a more central role in trying to bring some stability to that country. But apparently, CARICOM either does not have the capacity or maybe don't have the will. But, you know, Haiti bleeds. Haiti bleeds, continues to bleed. When it's not natural disasters, whether it's mudslides or earthquakes, hurricanes, it's political disaster. And the natural disasters themselves are political. Remember that earthquake in 2010. There was an earthquake in Argentina at the same time. And I think the earthquake in Argentina was technically a more devastating earthquake. But the effect on Argentina was much, much less than an earthquake of the same magnitude in Haiti. What it meant is that the Haitian infrastructure could not withstand that natural disaster, whereas the Argentinian infrastructure, much more developed, was able to withstand it. I went to Haiti a year after, and it was, oh my God. You know, you see people living in these tent camps and the physical devastation. And oh my. And Haiti continues to exist there on the edges, always on the edge, always on the edge, always on the edge, always on the edge. All of us need, we have a responsibility, the entire African diaspora, to the Haitians. And when you think that Haitians are going to other Caribbean countries and are being sent away, it's not. It's Guyana. Guyana may be the most vicious, but it happens in the other CARICOM countries. Look at what they did to them there in Texas under that bridge. So obviously people are fleeing the sorry situation in that country, and their brothers and sisters are rejecting them in the diaspora. We know the way the Americans are operating when in the 1990s, Cubans were fleeing Cuba and the Haitians were fleeing Haiti. The Cubans would be accepted into Miami and the Haitians would be sent back on those rickety boats. Many of them died. Would be sent back to Haiti. And that is part of the anti-Black racism. That is not just national, it's global. It's part of foreign policy of the United States of America, foreign policy of the Caribbean countries. In Guyana, they gave us the flimsy excuse that the Haitians are part of human trafficking ring. Since when the Guyana government is concerned about human trafficking? They have human trafficking going on in Guyana that involves people who may be friends of the government. We know that the stance taken against the Haitians by the Guyanese government has to do with the fear that Haitians would come here and it would increase the Black population and that would have electoral consequences. We know that's their position. Haiti, I'm sorry, says David Rudder, we misunderstood you. One day we'll turn our heads and look inside you. One day we'll turn our heads and restore your glory. And to restore the Haitian glory, we have to restore our glory where we are. We are in Guyana. And if we restore the African glory in Guyana, we'll be restoring the African glory in the world, including Haiti. We can only help Haiti if we are able to help ourselves. And we are in a good position to begin to help ourselves in Guyana. Reparations must be our watchword. Over the emancipation period, I've been calling for reparations from the state of Guyana so that we have a two-pronged approach to reparation. Reparations from the Europeans, as Lady B said, because the evolution of European capitalism and European wealth, including the United States is not physically in Europe, but it is culturally part of the European empire. And the wealth of Europe, Western Europe, is directly related to the enslavement of Africans. Directly related. That is why Walter Rodney wrote that phenomenal book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, showed that when Europe made contact with Africa, Africa was much more developed. And as Europeans increased their contact, we saw the underdevelopment of Africa and the development of Europe. So that the underdevelopment of Africa and its diaspora has to do with the development of Europe. When you're going to bleed a continent of 80 million of its people and more, you are underdeveloping. And when you take that labor and you exploit that labor in the so-called Americas without paying it, you're underdeveloping the source of the labor, and then the labor itself becomes dehumanized, and then the place where you're exploiting the labor itself becomes underdevelopment. It's a massive scheme of underdevelopment. That is why reparations are important, to repair the damage of slavery, colonialism. And as I've said, the state of Guyana has to play its role It is a successor state of the slave state and the colonial state. And the very notion of a Guyana, in its physical sense, in its civilized sense, in its larger economic sense, could not be there without African labor. This is not about favoritism for Africans. We didn't ask to come. We didn't. We were brought here against our will, and they work us against our will. It's a human rights question. And so the state of Guyana must not just join with others in calling on Africa for reparations, for compensation. They must stump up, because we're not sure that when the reparations come to the state of Guyana, that they will use that reparations on Africans. Because we are saying we already have reparations from Mother Nature. We have found oil. And the government of Guyana is not distributing that reparation, that source of reparation, equally. Tonight, I want to take it a little bit further. There are 14 oil blocks that are going to be auctioned next month. 14 oil blocks. Already, we have a lot of oil blocks. None is owned by Africans. None is owned by Black people. At least 2 other ethnic groups are part of the ownership of oil blocks, the existing oil blocks, either as part owners or full owners. None of the oil blocks is owned or part owned by Africans. And we have 14 blocks that are going to be auctioned. And I'm making an appeal, I'm making a call here tonight for some kind of affirmative action in the distribution of those oil blocks. I know there's going to be an auction, but we know that auctions can be manipulated to give the oil blocks to whoever you want to give it to. And I'm saying, as a start, at least 3 of those oil blocks should be set aside for African ownership. At least. We've got to get serious now, because it is the oil from which the wealth comes. And if you own oil blocks, wealth will flow. I'm assuming that there are African Guyanese business people, either together or individually, that are going to be bidding for those oil blocks. I know of at least one grouping. And I know it's an auction, and an auction is going to be depending on the market and who bids higher. And I'm saying, yes, I understand that. But there must be, I am arguing, some kind of set aside for Africans. At least 2 to 3 of those blocks should be owned by Africans. The government has a responsibility. There are economists who know that story. I'm going to be talking to Professor Thomas about how that could be done. We know the market is not free. An old Courtney Blackman, an economist from Jamaica and former diplomat, he once told me in an interview, he said, David, if it's a market, it's not free. And if it's free, it's not a market. Markets have to be regulated. Markets can't be free. So he said it's nonsensical to talk about free market. Markets, by their very nature, are regulated. That is why you have the World Trade Organization to regulate world trade. You all get it? The IMF to regulate and integrate the world finances. So this nonsense about a free market is what it is, nonsense. So people are going to say the auctions that are going to happen, they say next month, has to be done within the context of the market, but the market itself is regulated. And it's regulated in a way that gives advantage to those who are best placed economically to take advantage of the market. So I'm saying that whatever they do with those auctions, I am calling for at least 2 to 3 of those oil blocks. Even if you have to set them aside and let groups of African businessmen, let them bid among themselves. You know, the Europeans had that thing that it used to do with our oil, our rum and so on, protectionism. They set aside 5% of the market for our bananas until the United States put an end to that. So I'm saying if they set aside a certain number of blocks, for African Guyanese to bid among themselves, that will ensure that some of those blocks go to African Guyanese. Some people may say, well, why don't you set it aside for Guyanese to bid? That is not a bad proposition, but there are at least 2 ethnic groups that already own. So to give Africans an equitable chance, I'm calling for setting aside of some of the blocks. And you know, I'm saying 2 or 3 because we have to start. That is not equitable. But at least we start somewhere in guaranteeing that all our ethnic groups get ownership of the oil blocks. And I want you all to begin to think about those ideas. Because if we are able to work it through, we are going to be able to make demands. And this is what I mean, that we have to prepare for an election. But at the same time we are preparing for an election, we have to start demanding things right now. We have to start demanding things right now. And so let us demand that at least a couple of those oil blocks be set aside for African Guyanese. African Guyanese will get nothing if we don't demand something. We demand a voters list, a clean voters list. We demand biometrics. Those things will ensure that we get free and fair elections. But we have to demand more. We have to demand economic outcomes. And this is where the oil blocks come in. Good evening, Brother Carl Wong. Good evening, my brother. Carl Miller, good evening. Good evening, Auntie Brenda. Good evening, Cecile. So I want us to think about these things and let our leaders know that our demands have to be broadened. Demand a clean voters list. Demand biometrics. Demand a credible electoral machinery so that we can have credible electoral outcomes. But we have to demand economically tangible economic demands. Set aside some of the oil blocks and let African business people bid for those blocks. It is not a new concept, like I said. The Europeans set aside some of their banana market, some of the rum market, the Lomé Convention, they call them. And we have to make those demands. You see, we are not making demands to Africans because we don't think about Africans as a category. My brother, Kimani Nehusi, who we have to get on this program, made that point at the Coffee 250 State of the African Guyanese. You make demands for your group if you see your group as a tangible group in the society. You see, if we say we are only Guyanese, then we can only make demands as Guyanese, while other groups are making demands as groups. This has been one of the problems of the African Guyanese community. Our political leaders make demands on our behalf only as Guyanese, only as working people. And they never make demands for us as African Guyanese. So when you see the political system, I think it's Mr. Eastman said that, he says, you put demands into the system and the system spits out policies as outcomes. So if you only put in demands as Guyanese, you get Guyanese outcomes. If you put in demands as Africans, you are at least forcing the decision makers to think about outcomes as Africans. Sugar workers put in demands all the time as sugar workers, and sugar workers in Guyana mean East Indians. Yes, there are some Africans in Wales Estate, for example. There, I think about 1/3 of the workers, they were Africans. But generally, when you say sugar workers, you're talking East Indian. When you say hinterland, you're talking Amerindians. So when you're talking about carbon credits and so on, none of that coming to Africans, going to Amerindians. That's the euphemism for Amerindian. When you talk about sugar workers, you're talking about East Indians. And look at the money that governments after governments are putting into the sugar. And a lot of that subsidizing of the sugar, we are really subsidizing the buyers of the sugar, the Europeans. Because when you produce sugar at 40 cents a pound and you're selling at 15 cents, it means that you're subsidizing 25 cents. And that 25 cents, the large majority of it is going to Europeans, the buyers of the sugar. Some of it is going to East Indians, mainly East Indian sugar workers. But the subsidizing of the sugar is a political move. The government is not getting up and say, we are engaging in a policy to benefit Europeans. No. We are engaging in a political act that will benefit the PPP because it will allow them to hold on to the East Indian vote and East Indian loyalty. And so East Indians will get something, the sugar workers. And in order for the East Indians to get something, you have to give some of that subsidy to the Europeans. That is the PPP's game. They're doing the same thing with oil. They're prepared to give Exxon a lot. So if they give Exxon 70%, they're left with 30%. And then that 30% that is left, 95% of it goes to their people. You all understand the economic game that is played there? Our leaders have to demand for Africans. You know, all the categories of workers have gotten a little something by way of handouts. Not the civil servants, not the public servants. They've gotten the least or nothing. And when you say civil servants, what do you mean? African. And the civil servants have gotten the least of they had the little handouts. Which means Africans have gotten the least. Sugar workers, I think they've gotten the most. I'm talking about crumbs, yeah? I'm not talking about the big thing. I'm talking about crumbs. Fisher people get some. Rice farmers get some. When you take rice farmers, sugar workers, and fisher people, in many regards, they're sugar workers who are rice farmers. So you go in an Indian Guyanese family, you have a sugar worker, a rice farmer, and a fisherman. So when you're giving these handouts, one family in the Indian community is benefiting sometimes 2-3 times. Now, am I saying that Indian Guyanese should not benefit? Oh God, no, they should. They should. So don't go and say, David, I say, you know, Indians should not get, because when you add up what they get as fisherman, cane cutter, or cane harvester, or sugar worker, and what they get from rice, it still can't rival what the big elites are getting. But at least it is more than what the public servant is getting. I went by one of my friends the other day, and he was telling me, I think they give them $100,000 or $200,000 for business. And he said they give them the money, but the cement that they got to buy and the things they got to buy to build up the infrastructure of the business, they tell them they have to go and buy from certain business people, certain retail places. And those retail places, those business places that they have to go and spend this money that the government is, it's Indian and Portuguese owned business. So you're giving the money, this $200,000, you say you're giving it to small business, but it's your way of funneling money to the Indian and Portuguese elites. So a lot of trickery is going on. And our leaders have to put an end to it. I continue to say it, that I think our political leaders are either misconceived about the situation, and I think that's a tiny minority. I think they understand what the deal is. But they're not acculturized politically to make representation for the people as a race. After Burnham, that has been a problem in the PNC. So that is why Africans get little or nothing. Because when the other side is in there, they do not use their leverage to get things directly for their supporters as a group. And when they get power, they don't orient their policies to address the racial inequities. And you all have to put pressure on the PNC. The Indians put pressure on the PPP. And that is why the PPP responds. I said last night, if you take away the African vote from the PNC becomes a small party. And I know they're going to say David Hines is trying to push the PNC to be more radical. David Hines is an outlier, as they say in thing, and David Hines is trying to push Norton to be more radical, and they'll say all those kind of things. No, I am trying to push our people, to push their leaders to look after their interests. And when the African interest is looked after, and the Amerindian interest is looked after, and the East Indian interest is looked after, in an equitable way, the interests of the poor is looked after, because the majority of the poor come from African, East Indian, and Amerindian communities. So you start off looking after your racial interests, your individual racial interests, but the outcome is that you end up looking after your class interests. So those who said, well, Heinz, why you don't talk about class, why you always talk about race? Race and class in Guyana are intertwined. The majority of people who are poor are Amerindians, East Indians, and Africans. And so there is an intertwining of race and class. So we have to make direct demands for public servants. The whole nonsense about if you pay public servants more money, it will lead to inflation, too much money in the system. That has to go. The government has the responsibility to put things in place to fight inflation. It can be inflation or alleviation of poverty. So I can alleviate poverty among Africans because it will lead to inflation. What kind of nonsense is that? You have to be able to alleviate poverty and let the technicians work out how you alleviate poverty while keeping inflation down. It can be done. I am not an economist, so I'm not going to venture to speak on that, but I know it can be done. And the presence of oil is obviously going to be leading to the expansion of the entrepreneurial class in Guyana, the business class in Guyana. Oil is going to lead to an expansion of that class. It is not just directly from the oil and gas economy, but indirectly, the spin-offs from the economy, from the oil and gas sector. And African Guyanese are underrepresented. Now, you can't say, well, it's a problem for Indian Guyanese. No, Indian Guyanese are represented and probably overrepresented in the business sector. Portuguese Guyanese are more than overrepresented. And African Guyanese are more than underrepresented. And there has to be policy to ensure that African Guyanese become represented in that class. Because racial representation in the business class will have consequences for the different racial groups. Because what the trickle-down neoliberal economy is about is that money is made at the top and some of it trickles down to the bottom via employment and all the other things. And so if you have representation in the business sector, more than likely, most of your trickle down will go to the Indian Guyanese communities. You're more likely to employ Indian Guyanese. When you're giving donations to charity, you're more likely to do it in your own community. So if Africans are not involved in that business class, the chances of trickle down into the African Guyanese community is limited. So we have to raise our voices louder and demand that there's African representation in the ownership of those oil blocks. 14 of them are going to be auctioned next month if the government keeps its promise finally. At present, 0. Africans do not own any of the oil blocks. And Africans make up almost 50% of the population. They say, they're 30% Black Africans, but there are a lot of mixed people identify as Africans. So the Black population in Guyana is close to 50%. There are a lot of Douglas that identify as African, and there's some that identify as Indians. I heard they talk this nonsense that, Indians are a minority. By the time you add the Douglas and so on to the Indians, they're gone back to a majority. And Africans are close to a majority when you add them, because we know in Guyana, you have what is called straight-haired Douglas and hard-haired Douglas. It depends on how you identify. You see, the question of identity is important. Douglarism is not an identity. It's a categorization, but it's not an identity. The only country in the world that recognized mixed race was South Africa during apartheid. They recognized the colored as a race. In the United States, biracial is not recognized as a race. Guyana, Douglas is not recognized as a race. Douglas can switch. I rather suspect that Douglas living in the Indian communities identify as Indians, and the Douglas living in the Black, I know that for certain. Douglas who live in Black communities that identify as Black. It's natural. If you're a Douglas person or mixed person, you live in a Black community, you have little or no choice but to identify as Black. And the same thing for Indian communities. I don't know much about what happens in the Amerindian communities, but I know Amerindians who are mixed and come to the coastland, they identify with the 2 large ethnic groups, the mixed ones, the mixed Amerindians. So we get confused sometimes with these things. People say, well, our race problem will go if you Douglarize the whole country. I've never heard more nonsense in my life. Pardon me for laughing, but it's nonsensical. The Brazilians had a policy of Douglarizing, they call it whitening, because they wanted to create the Brazilian person. They wanted to get rid of race. And so whereas in the United States, they wanted to get rid of race by separating the race, in Brazil, they sought to get rid of the race by mixing the race. And what? Brazil end up with 80 million black people, the most black people, the largest black population outside of Africa, and the largest black population after Nigeria. And that came, and if you add those with African mixture, it goes up to 105 to 110 million. And that out of 180 something million. Do you all do the maths? So people think that if you Douglarize, race go away. Pardon me for laughing, because some people really believe it. You know, they really believe it. They really believe it. You know, there's not such a category of people, but it doesn't go away. You know, one of the things that, you know, we talk about the slave catchers in Africa, those who sold their brothers into slavery and so on. A colleague of mine does research in a part of Africa, and there are some people you call pigeon people. They're a mixture between white people and black people. When the Portuguese first went to Africa, of course, the men, mostly, they interacted with the women, and they created this category of people, the mixed people, they call them pigeon, and they speak just like us in the West. They speak just like us Creoles. And his research is showing that they were the ones who were most involved in the slave trade. The mix, Portuguese and black. They were very big in the slave trade, and they're there somewhere in between Benin and Nigeria and so on. He does wonderful research on that. And when he played the tape for us to hear them speak, they speak almost like West Indians. So the mixing and Douglarization doesn't end the race. In fact, it probably compounds race. And the Brazilians were to find that out. The Brazilians were to find that out. So we have got to, African people, we've got to become more African. I'm not talking here about African superiority. I'm not talking about developing African prejudice. I'm not into that, although people think that that's what I spend my life doing. I'm not into African superiority. I'm not into African prejudice. I believe that African people will be more respectful to themselves, or will be more respectable to other people if they're more respectable to themselves. And that is why, for me, the socialization of an African who's conscious of his identity, her identity, but conscious that he or she ought not to be engaged in a sense of superiority and supremacy. So I'm not into African supremacy. In the first place, I don't know how that will look. I don't know how African supremacy will look, because the two things are so diametrically opposed, Africanism and superiority. Because the very notion of Africanism is a rejection of superiority. So I sometimes I can't, you know, we don't have the caste system. You know, like in India, there's a caste system. And so one can point to a sense of superiority among some sections of Indian society, both in India and the diaspora, arising out of the caste system. We have a color system among Africans. We do have a color. Red-skinned people have a sense of class superiority among themselves. That is true. But they don't get to wield the power. They don't get to wield the power in the same way. There are some instances. If you take a place like Jamaica, Michael Manley was of that class. His mother was white and his father half white, half black. And so he was the brown man. But Michael Manley used the power between 72 and 80 to blacken Jamaica in terms of policy. His opponent, Siaga, went in the other direction. And so when Jamaica finally elected a phenotypically black prime minister in 1993, I think, P.J. Patterson, they never looked back. And Siaga went to his grave, feel that Jamaicans did him wrong. But insofar as Jamaica had a choice between two mulattoes, thank you, brother, you know, the term mulatto or brown man, insofar as they had a choice between two mulatto, that was it, they choose one. But once Jamaicans got a chance to elect black leaders, phenotypically black leaders, they start doing it. Especially in the PNP. So the question of race is so misunderstood in a place like Guyana. John is saying when you are mixed, you are deemed an outcast. That is why the so-called mixed person deal very viciously with the straight ethnic groups on certain issues. You're quite right. You're quite right. You're quite right, John. I grew up in a village in which red people see hell. My mother, very fair skin, and my father, very dark skin. And so some of my siblings are fair skin. And there are all kind of names they get, Red Ezel, Red Man. So they saw hell because it was an Africanized village that saw black color as it. And so if you were not black skin, they tease you a lot. Bob Marley got a lot of teasing. They used to call him, you know, half white, half caste. When he started to chat up Rita Marley, she was hesitant because she said, you know, at that time in Jamaica, as Jamaica is becoming blacker, becoming independent, the dream of any young girl was to have a tall, handsome, dark-skinned black man. And she said, you know, Bob wasn't even black. He was half caste. And Bob became black when he became a Rasta. He became black when he became a Rasta, and the black community in Jamaica accepted him. Of course, he was rejected by his father's family. His father's family, the Marleys, rejected him. So he became a Rastafarian and became black. It was that reason the other night when GHK Lal went to Boston, I said, you know, there's phenotypical blackness, those of us who have dark skin. And then there's ideological blackness. You may not have dark skin. You may be of another ethnic group, but you identify with the struggles of black people. You understand the struggles of the black people. And so you develop an ideological blackness. And I said that, you know, in that sense, in an ideological sense, Lal is blacker than Mark Phillips and Warren Edgehill because they have rejected their own blackness. They're phenotypically black, but ideologically and culturally, they've rejected blackness. They've not embraced it. You know, Brother Mark talks about how many Afrocentric books he reads. Well, if you got to read Afrocentric books to become Afrocentric, you already got a problem. You already got a problem. You're Afrocentric. And then you read the books to further affirm your Afrocentricity. You don't read the books to become Afrocentric, Brother Mark. If you got to do that, you're in trouble. Those books are meant to reinforce identity, but also meant for other ethnic groups to understand the Black experience. So we've got to make those demands, and I'm calling for the demand for oil blocks, and I'll be following up with that. There's a big story in the Stabroek News today. Police complaints head accuses the top cop of violating an act. It says the ranks are not aware of the relevant laws. It's an interesting story, and I'm going to deal with that. Tomorrow night, I think it Padagy I'm getting, but certainly on Thursday night, I'm going to bring Brother Paul Slow, and we're going to talk about that because the police complaints, the chair of the Police Complaints Authority is accusing the commissioner of breaking the law. He's essentially saying that cases that should be investigated by the Police Complaints Authority are being investigated by the police. And he cited the Quindon Bacchus case. Oh my God. That's a bombshell. Stabroek News is carried. I didn't see it in Kaitro News or the other media. And we're going to be dealing with it here on Politics 101 on Thursday with Brother Paul Slow. That's a big story. He cited the relevant legal authority. I'm trying to get Brother Slow, he's our go-to man. I'm going to try to see if I get one of the lawyers, maybe Brother Roysdale Ford, who said he was going to come back with us. But we're going to delve into that on Thursday. Big story. Big story. Because we always suspected something was happening. And that is why they don't want us to talk. The Commission of Police has been breaking the law because certain cases that should be sent to the Police Complaints Authority, and then it is the Police Complaints Authority that advises whether the matter is sent to the DPP or not. But the police, and he cited 4 cases. The Stabroek News story only told us about, there are 2 cases they told us about. They told us about the Quindon Bacchus case. And I think the Nobrega case is another case, but I think he cited 4 cases. So we're going to deal with that on Thursday. But tonight, we must demand. You all go on social media, wherever, and call for some of the oil blocks to be set aside for Black business people to bid for them. We got to push, as old people say, push some fire. Okay, if we don't push it, nobody gonna push it. Nobody gonna push it. And I'm going to be on their case with it. Because that is part of the state of Guyana making reparations to Black people. And I'm saying we deserve reparations. As I said, Ali and Jack Dion, the PPP, don't owe Black people nothing. They don't owe us nothing. It is the state of Guyana that they have usurped that owes us something. And insofar as they've usurped that state as an installed regime and refusing to put in place the necessary arrangements so that Black people can get our just reward, in that sense, they're violating us like the slave masters. Indian people don't owe us nothing. Insofar as Indian people got things out of the system, they got it because they demanded it. They got it because they demanded it. So Indian people don't owe us anything. Indian people are not our enemies. Of course, there's some of them who behave as if they're our enemies. They act as though they are our enemies, but Indian people are not our historical enemies. Indian people don't owe us nothing. It is the state of Guyana that owes us. And insofar as the government that gets its vote from Indian Guyanese are doing us anything wrong, they are standing in the way of the state compensating us. And they're fooling poor people of all races with these little handouts. So they give the Indian poor a little bit more, a lump. And they give the African poor and the Amerindian poor a little crumb. And so the Indian with a little lump feels that he or she is getting more. And the African with his little crumb, that is a little bit bigger than the Amerindian crumb, is believing that, oh my God, thank God. Look what the PPP is giving me. I'm making money. I see some chaps who play sport for this country, who went to good school. I'm making money. I'm making money. And you want to know, are you aware of your self-worth? You making a little bit of money? Do you compare how much money you make with what your counterparts, your peers of other ethnic groups are making? Dick Gregory used to ask, what kind of fool is you? What kind of fool is you? And you're making money. How much of that money is trickling down into your black community? All of you all who've been with Ali to China, what you all bring back for black people? How much is trickling down into your black community? Where are your businesses that you're opening in the black community? That's when I will know of your ethnic loyalty. Where you're looking after yourself. Your bank account look a little fat than it used to be. And that's all your interest is in. At some point, we have to deal with those fellas, you know. And they're fellas, you know. They're men. At some point, we got to deal with them. We've been very lenient in the black community with the slave catchers, the house slaves, and the downright foolish black, especially some of them young black men. Downright foolish. We've been lenient with them. We can't allow those people to become role models in our community at all. They're destructive. And we got to straighten them. I'm not talking about harming anybody, less the so-called, thing. I'm not talking about harming anybody. I'm talking about strengthening them in terms of their consciousness. Because they're fathers of some of our children. They're husbands of some of our women, boyfriends and so on. They're sons of some of our elders. And we have to have a frank conversation about how we deal with such people. I mean, they don't represent a critical mass. But because they get so much publicity in the state media and other media, it looks as though it's plenty of them. It's not plenty of them, comparatively speaking. But we still got to deal with them. We still got to deal with them. So there we go, sisters and brothers. Tomorrow night, we're going to get back to that African Guyanese action plan that Equitably has prepared. And then Thursday night, we are going to be dealing with that issue of the Commissioner of Police breaking the law, breaking the law, breaking the law. So you all stay put, please. Those of you in Guyana, please, you all be careful on that road, man. Oh gosh, we're killing ourselves, man. We're killing ourselves. I mean, people calling me today, Dr. Hines, every time the PPP come to power, so many people dying from fire, so many people dying from accident, so many. And you know, I mean, the numbers are showing that. I don't want to put any kind of scientific thing to it, but the fact of the matter, it's too much. I'm appealing to our young people. Good evening, Linda Campbell, Linda Coquet. It was nice seeing you after years in Buxton. After years seeing you, it was nice seeing you. And thanks to the support that you've given to our program from beginning to end. Without people like you, you know, people who come through for our programs without us having to beg, a little donation here and there, it makes a difference. And Linda, you're one of the persons who has religiously come through for our programs, and we thank you so much. 11 Dotty Bill Dam, 11 Little Dotty Bill Dam. We don't have big businessmen and big businesswomen who are going to say, Dr. Hines, I like what you're doing. The program can do with some technical improvement. You know, here is a donation for that. We don't have that kind of big businessmen. But I have to thank God for some small business people who have come through for us. As I said, this emancipation, we were able to raise money to help with emancipation in Buxton and in Belladrum. We were able to help Coffee 250 with their thing on Sunday. And so it's about raising funds for our causes. And I continue to ask you, don't make us have to, you know, beg you all and so on and so forth, right? And there's some people who don't make us beg. I've gone to events. I've, you know, been to funerals in Buxton, and I would feel somebody hand in my hand and they slip a little something. These are people who can barely afford to put food on their table, and who make sure they give that little contribution. You know, it says quite a lot, And I want to thank you all. I want to thank those of you who have stood by us as we stand by you. So I'll see you all tomorrow night. And love is the watchword.
If you hear